April 10, 1912. A pale gray dawn spread over the harbor at Southampton, carrying a chill that bit through the early morning mist. Out beyond the docks, the RMS Titanic rested like a sleeping giant, her black hull gleaming with dew, her towering white decks catching the first light of day. To the people who stood below, gazing up in awe, she looked less like a ship and more like a palace afloat on steel and steam, the greatest machine man had ever built. For many Americans, Titanic was more than a vessel. It was a promise. She represented progress, prosperity, and the boundless confidence of a young century. Newspapers across the United States had written of her luxury, her safety, her sheer grandeur. Unsinkable, they said, as if the word itself could defy nature. And now, as the whistles blew and the docks filled with noise and movement, American families, businessmen, and travelers arrived, their hearts alive with excitement. Trunks rattled, porters shouted, and children clung to their mothers' skirts, staring wide-eyed at the ship that would carry them across the Atlantic. Among the crowd was Margaret Molly Brown, a woman from Denver, known for her wit, her laughter, and her heart as bold as the Rocky Mountains. She stood near the gangway, wrapped in a fur-lined coat, watching the scene with quiet curiosity. She had traveled widely, seen great cities, but even she felt humbled before the Titanic's scale. Nearby, Colonel John Jacob Astor, one of America's richest men, guided his young wife Madeline up the ramp. They moved with calm grace, though whispers followed them, of scandal, of fortune, of the glittering life they led in New York society. The Titanic was their passage home after a long European honeymoon, and the newspapers were already writing about their return. Further down the line, the families of humbler means waited their turn. Immigrants from Ireland, Sweden, and the American Midwest, their hands rough, their eyes bright with hope. To them, the Titanic was more than luxury. It was a bridge to a new life, a golden road to America. They had spent their savings for a chance to board this ship of wonder, this miracle of modern engineering that promised a safe and swift passage. As the clock neared noon, the Titanic's beep whistle sounded, a low, thunderous call that rolled across the harbor. People on shore waved handkerchiefs and hats, shouting their farewells. Steam hissed from her funnels, gulls circled overhead, and the air seemed to shimmer with excitement and pride. Slowly, majestically, the ship began to move. For a moment, the crowd fell silent, simply watching her glide away. 2,200 souls aboard, carried by faith and steel into the open sea. From the upper decks, passengers gazed down at the shrinking docks. Some waved until their arms ached. Others stood quietly, lost in thought. The band played a cheerful tune as smoke trailed upward into the soft April sky. Margaret Molly Brown leaned against the railing, her gloved hands resting on the polished wood. She smiled faintly as the sound of cheering drifted back from shore. Around her, American voices mingled with accents from all over Europe, a floating city of dreams and destinies. She looked out across the water, whispering to herself, "What a world this is becoming." As the Titanic moved toward the open channel, the hum of her engines became a heartbeat, steady and strong. Inside, life began to settle into rhythm. Stewards guided passengers to their rooms, each one a small world of its own. The first-class suites were like fine hotels, with velvet drapes, silver lamps, and private promenades. In second class, travelers found neat, comfortable cabins, while in third class, families unpacked what little they owned and marveled at the clean linens and warm lighting, luxuries beyond their imagination. In the grand dining saloon, the tables were set with white linen and crystal glasses that caught the light. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the aroma of roasted meat and sweet pastries. Waiters moved swiftly, their polished shoes whispering on the floor. Everywhere conversation flowed about business, travel, love, and the marvel of the ship itself. "Imagine crossing the Atlantic in such comfort," one gentleman said. "It's like living in a hotel that sails," his companion replied. And above them all, Captain Edward J. Smith, the most experienced captain of the White Star Line, stood proudly on the bridge, his white beard bright in the sunlight. He had guided countless ships across the Atlantic, and this, his final voyage before retirement, was to be his crowning achievement. As evening fell, the horizon turned to gold, then deep violet. The Titanic steamed steadily toward the western sea. On the upper decks, couples strolled under electric lights that glowed softly like stars. A band played near the grand staircase, and the sound of a waltz drifted into the cool air. Somewhere below, children laughed in the third-class playroom. In the smoking room, men spoke of politics and the stock market. And in the wireless room, young operators tapped out messages, love notes, business orders, greetings from ship to shore, carried by invisible signals that danced through the air. The Titanic seemed alive, breathing with the rhythm of human joy. For those on board, the voyage was not just a journey, it was a celebration of the age. The world felt young, unstoppable, invincible. Science had conquered distance, and the ocean itself seemed tamed. Few could imagine that nature still had the power to humble man's creations. That night, the sea was calm, almost eerily so. The moonlight painted the waves silver as the Titanic sailed onward. Inside, laughter continued late into the night. In her suite, Madeline Astor wrote in her journal, describing the beauty of the ship. "It feels as though we are living in a floating dream. Everything glows. Everything feels endless." Down in third class, an Irish boy named Patrick Daly stared out through a small porthole. He was only 14, traveling with his mother and 2 sisters, bound for a new life in Boston. He pressed his hand against the glass, watching the stars shimmer on the black water. "America's out there somewhere," his mother whispered beside him, "just a few days more." He nodded, believing her completely.
By the second day at sea, the Titanic had become a world unto itself. Friendships bloomed between strangers. Passengers explored the decks, visited the gymnasium, or wrote letters in the reading room. Every moment felt touched with wonder, the kind that comes before history turns its page. In the smoking lounge, Colonel Astor smiled as he played cards with other gentlemen. "They say not even God could sink this ship," one of them joked lightly. The men laughed, unaware of how those words would one day echo across generations. At dinner, waiters poured fine wine as a string quartet played softly in the corner. Molly Brown raised her glass. "To safe travels," she said warmly, "and to the bright future ahead." Outside, the sea stretched endlessly, a dark mirror reflecting the lights of the ship. From a distance, the Titanic looked like a small city adrift in eternity. Her funnels breathed slow plumes of smoke that drifted into the heavens. The wind was cold but gentle. Somewhere, a child's lullaby carried faintly through the air. It was a perfect night to dream. No one knew that far ahead, hidden in the path of that sleeping sea, a silent wall of ice waited. No one knew that this voyage, so filled with laughter, luxury, and hope, would soon become the most tragic tale in maritime history. But on that first night, as the ship of dreams sailed westward, the world still felt whole. The passengers, rich and poor, young and old, slept peacefully in their cabins, rocked gently by the calm Atlantic waves. The great engines hummed beneath them, steady and strong, like the heartbeat of destiny itself. Somewhere above deck, Captain Smith looked out across the dark horizon and smiled faintly. "Smooth sailing," he murmured to his officers, "just the way it should be." And beneath the endless stars, the Titanic glided forward, her lights shimmering like a constellation on the water. The voyage had only just begun. The dream was still alive. April 11th, 1912. Dawn broke clear and pale as the Titanic glided through the waters off the Irish coast. The air was crisp, touched with salt and sunlight. Small fishing boats bobbed in the distance, their crews pausing to stare at the magnificent liner that dwarfed everything around it. From the decks, passengers waved to the tiny figures below, unaware that they were waving farewell to solid ground for the last time. The Titanic had taken on her final passengers at Queenstown, Ireland. Among them were dozens of Americans returning home, businessmen, students, tourists, and families. Some had spent months in Europe for pleasure or trade. Others had crossed the ocean seeking roots and now sought return to the soil they called home. For each, this ship was more than transportation. It was a symbol of promise. Inside, the Titanic pulsed with life. The engines thrummed beneath the decks, their rhythm steady and confident. The corridors smelled faintly of varnished wood, fresh linens, and polished brass. The great ship was at her prime, her heart alive, her purpose clear. On the first-class promenade, John Jacob Astor stood with his young wife, Madeline, the wind brushing her hair beneath a silk scarf. They gazed at the endless sea, blue and shimmering beneath the spring sun. "Just think," she said softly, "by next week we'll see the skyline again, New York shining in the distance." Astor smiled faintly. "It will be good to be home," he replied, "though this ship almost makes me wish the journey were longer." Madeline laughed, a quiet sound lost to the wind. Around them, gentlemen in wool coats strolled the deck, while women in pastel dresses admired the horizon through gloved hands and parasols. There was something intoxicating about the ocean, the vastness, the light, the sense of being between worlds. Further aft, Margaret Brown, known to all simply as Molly, leaned on the rail, talking easily with fellow passengers. She had a gift for conversation, a warmth that made even the most reserved travelers smile. "Ain't it grand," she said, gazing at the ship's wake curling away behind them. "All that power and still so smooth you could drink tea without a ripple." A young English woman beside her laughed. "They say it's the safest ship ever built." Molly nodded. "I believe it. But, you know, I've learned something in my time. The sea doesn't give promises. It only lends them." Her words lingered in the air, soft and thoughtful, like the faint hum of the wind through the rigging. Below deck, the rhythm of daily life was simple but content. In second class, travelers played cards in the lounge, read newspapers from New York and London, or leaned out along the rails to watch the rolling sea. Some were American teachers, others engineers returning from studies abroad. They spoke of opportunity, of new inventions, of cities growing taller each year, of airplanes and electricity and the bright age to come. One man, William Greenfield, a Boston schoolteacher, wrote in his journal that afternoon,
To stand upon this deck is to see the future itself, a future built by human hands, carried across the water by courage and steel. The world feels wide open, full of light. He tucked the notebook into his coat, unaware those words would one day outlive him. In third class, the mood was different but no less hopeful. The corridors bustled with children's laughter, the scent of soup and bread wafting from the dining hall. Immigrant families, Swedish, Irish, Italian, shared stories, songs, and dreams of America. Some had never seen a city, let alone a ship like this. For them, the Titanic was a miracle, a place where even the poor could sleep in clean beds, eat warm meals, and glimpse the comfort of a better world. A young American woman, Eleanor Franklin, sat beside an Irish mother, sewing a small doll from scraps of fabric. "It's for your little one," she said kindly. The mother smiled with weary gratitude. "Thank you, miss. She's never had a doll before." Eleanor looked down at the tiny cloth figure and thought of her own childhood in Kansas, how her mother had sewn her one from flour sack cloth. The memory made her eyes soften. "Then she'll keep this one forever," she said. Above them, the faint music of the ship's band floated down through the decks, a waltz drifting like perfume through the air. By afternoon, the Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction, calm as glass. The sun hung high and bright, glittering off the waves. From the crow nest, the lookouts scanned the horizon, their eyes narrowed against the glare. Nothing to see, only sea and sky. The Titanic cut through the water like a blade, her wake trailing white and foamy behind. In the wireless room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride tapped out messages across the airwaves, notes from passengers to loved ones in America. "Safe aboard Titanic. Weather fine, spirits high." Another, "Crossing peaceful. Love to the children." The clicking of the telegraph keys filled the small room like a heartbeat, fast, steady, alive. Occasionally, signals came from other ships, routine traffic, greetings, position reports. The ocean was vast, yet through invisible waves, voices carried it across it. Humanity was shrinking the world, stitch by stitch, signal by signal. As dusk approached, the sky blushed gold and crimson. The ocean darkened to a deep, endless blue. On deck, passengers gathered to watch the sunset, leaning against the rails as the light slowly faded. A soft chill rose from the water, and stewards moved through the crowd offering blankets and tea. In the first-class dining saloon, candles flickered on every table. Silverware gleamed, and the hum of conversation mixed with the quiet strains of a string quartet. The menu that evening included salmon with hollandaise, lamb with mint, and peach meringue. Waiters glided between the tables like dancers in white gloves. At one table, Molly Brown laughed at a joke from a young American officer. "If the world ends tomorrow," she said, raising her glass, "I'll still say this was the finest supper ever served on a ship." Laughter rippled through the room. The Titanic seemed untouchable, as if nothing bad could ever touch her gleaming decks or the bright lives aboard.
Outside, beneath the stars, the ship's lights glowed warm against the night. From a distance, she looked unreal, a golden city floating through the dark. Somewhere on the bridge, Captain Smith stood with his officers, binoculars in hand, watching the horizon. "Perfect weather," he murmured, "a fine night for sailing." He felt proud of the ship, of his crew, of the years of experience that had brought him here. Retirement waited at the end of this voyage, and he meant to finish with honor. The Titanic's engines pulsed below him like the steady beat of destiny. In the wireless room, Phillips continued tapping messages. The sound was soft and rhythmic, like rain on a window pane. CQD, CQD, the universal call sign of safety, echoed faintly in the night, unaware of how soon it would take on a different meaning. Down below, in third class, families drifted to sleep. Mothers tucked in their children, whispering promises of America, of green hills, wide streets, and the smell of bread baking in the morning. The ship rocked gently, a lullaby written by the sea. The hum of the engines filled the cabins with a steady comfort. For a few blessed hours, the world felt kind. Above them, first-class passengers gathered in the lounge, sipping coffee and talking softly of art, science, and the future. "The world is changing," said one man. "We are witnessing a new age of peace and prosperity." "Yes," another replied, gazing out the window at the stars, "an age where nothing seems impossible." Midnight came quietly. The ship's lamps glowed golden across the decks. In the smoking room, a few men lingered over brandy and cigars. In the music room, the last notes of a waltz faded into silence. Somewhere far below, a clock ticked softly. The Titanic sailed on, calm, confident, perfect. Across her decks, hundreds of Americans dreamed of the life awaiting them beyond the ocean. Families to reunite, businesses to grow, futures to build. They did not know that the ocean, beautiful and still, was keeping its own secret. That in the frozen dark beyond the horizon, icebergs drifted like sleeping giants, waiting in silence. But for now, the Titanic moved forward in grace and glory, her lights gleaming like hope itself. She carried not just people, but the faith of an entire era, an era that believed progress could never sink. And so she sailed on, across an ocean of promise. The morning of April 12th dawned with a hush of silver mist. The Titanic glided smoothly through calm seas, her wake a thin white ribbon trailing far behind. From the upper decks, the ocean looked endless, a mirror of blue and light, so vast that it made the mighty ship seem small. The air was crisp, cool, and fragrant with salt. It was a perfect day to be alive, and the passengers felt it. Inside, the ship thrummed softly with life. The engines deep below kept a steady rhythm, a heartbeat that seemed eternal. Above, sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting gold across polished wood and brass rails. The Titanic was more than a vessel now. She was a floating world, alive with laughter, voices, and the sound of music drifting faintly through the halls. In the first-class dining saloon, breakfast was being served. Waiters in white gloves moved gracefully among tables draped with linen, balancing trays of coffee, kippers, and fruit. China cups clinked softly, and polite laughter floated over the hum of conversation. The scent of toast and bacon mingled with fresh-cut flowers from the vases at every table. At one corner sat Margaret Molly Brown, reading a letter from her son in Colorado. "Keep your chin up, Mama, and come home soon," he had written. She smiled, folding the letter with care. Around her, the talk was light. Politics, art, rumors from Europe. She listened quietly, content to simply be among the sound of people and the luxury of peace. Nearby, Colonel John Jacob Astor and his wife Madeline shared tea. She wore a pale blue gown that caught the light, and he watched her with quiet affection. They spoke of New York, of their house on Fifth Avenue, of spring gardens soon to bloom. "We'll be home in time for the lilacs," she said. "Yes, the lilacs and the noise of the city. I've almost missed it." Around them, voices mixed, Americans, Englishmen, and Europeans, all joined in one grand floating society, bound by wealth, curiosity, and the shared wonder of the sea.
Yet beyond the glitter of first class, the Titanic's heart beat quietly in other decks. In second class, teachers, missionaries, and families gathered in their lounge, reading or playing cards. The air was filled with friendly chatter. A young American writer, Emily Carver, sat near the window, notebook open on her lap. She watched the endless waves and wrote, "The ship hums like a great dream. Around me are people full of hope, faces that carry the future. We are all travelers between worlds, adrift in light." In the third-class dining hall, laughter rang out as children chased one another between benches. Mothers scolded gently. Fathers told stories of the cities they would soon see. For many, this voyage was not luxury. It was salvation. They dreamed of new beginnings in New York, Chicago, Boston, places they knew only from postcards and letters home. An Irish mother named Bridget O'Rourke held her baby against her shoulder, humming a lullaby older than memory. Across from her sat a young Swedish carpenter, Olaf Lindström, who spoke shyly of finding work in Minnesota. "It's cold there," Bridget smiled. "A good man from Sweden will fit right in." He blushed, nodding, his rough hands folded on the table. Around them, the hum of the ship carried like a cradle song, constant, soothing, infinite. That afternoon, sunlight poured through the grand staircase, setting the crystal chandeliers aflame with color. Ladies in silk gowns ascended and descended, trailing perfume and laughter. The Titanic was a world of elegance, a dream built to dazzle. In the Palm Court Cafe, surrounded by glass and potted palms, a small orchestra played light melodies. The sound of violins mingled with the clinking of teacups and the gentle rustle of newspaper pages. Outside, the sea stretched flawless and calm, and many remarked that they had never seen such perfect weather. Captain Edward S. Smith, immaculate in his uniform, strolled the decks with a sense of pride. "She handles beautifully," he told his officers, "like a living creature, the finest ship ever built." Indeed, she was. Every bolt, every polished panel spoke of craftsmanship and care. The Titanic carried not just people, but the spirit of an age that believed it could master nature itself. As evening fell, lamps flickered to life across the decks. The ship glowed warm and golden against the darkening sky. Inside the first-class dining room, tables sparkled with silver and glass. Gentlemen in tuxedos and ladies in gowns filled the air with soft laughter and talk. The orchestra began a waltz, smooth and graceful.
Molly Brown dined with a group of new acquaintances, sharing stories of her travels in Europe. "I've seen kings and queens," she said, "but nothing quite so grand as this ship." Around her, the talk turned to America, to Wall Street, to politics, to the grand optimism of a country that seemed forever rising. At the Astor table, Madeline smiled as her husband told a quiet joke. The candlelight caught in her eyes, and for a moment time itself seemed to pause. The ship moved steadily through the night, its engines humming like a lullaby beneath their feet. In second class, the atmosphere was lively but modest. After dinner, a group gathered in the lounge to sing. A young minister played the piano, his fingers gentle on the keys. They sang, "Nearer, my God, to Thee," unaware how deeply that hymn would soon be carved into history. In third class, laughter carried through the corridors. The passengers there, so often forgotten in stories, danced to fiddles and flutes, clapping hands and stamping feet. Their joy was pure and unguarded, the joy of people who believed that tomorrow would be better. A young girl spun barefoot across the floor, her hair flying like gold in the lamplight. "We'll see New York soon," she cried. Her mother smiled and whispered, "Yes, my darling, just a few more days." Later that night, When most had retired to their cabins, a deep calm settled over the ship. The stars shone like shards of ice scattered across the sky. The ocean was so still that some said it seemed to hold its breath. Only the soft thrum of the engines broke the silence, a sound as steady as time itself. Molly Brown stood alone on deck, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She looked out across the black water, feeling the night breeze on her face. Somewhere in the dark, she thought she heard the faint cry of a seabird, a lonely, distant sound that sent a chill through her. "Strange," she whispered to herself, "so quiet, so very quiet." Behind her, a steward nodded politely as he passed. "Good evening, ma'am. Perfect weather tonight." "Yes," she said softly, "almost too perfect." In the bridge above, Captain Smith watched the horizon. He felt at peace, confident, proud, and perhaps a little sentimental. After this voyage, he would retire. The Titanic would be his final command, his farewell to the sea. "A fine ship," he murmured, "a fine ship indeed." Below deck, the stokers worked tirelessly in the heat and roar of the boiler rooms, feeding the furnaces that drove the great ship forward. Sweat streamed down their faces, and the air burned with coal and fire. Yet even there, in the heart of the machine, there was a strange kind of reverence, the knowledge that they were part of something magnificent. At midnight, the ship's clocks chimed softly through the corridors. One by one, the lights dimmed. Passengers drifted into dreams. Somewhere in first class, a gramophone played the last notes of a waltz before the needle lifted with a gentle click. The Titanic sailed on, her reflection shimmering faintly on the water below. From a distance, she looked like a floating constellation, a galaxy of light moving through the endless dark. No one aboard could imagine that those same stars would soon witness the unthinkable. For now, there was only peace, the splendor and the silence. April 10th, 1912. The morning Belfast wore a pale mist like a shroud, and through it the Titanic gleamed with quiet majesty. Docked at Southampton, the great liner stretched longer than any building in sight, a floating city of steel and velvet. To those who gazed upon her, she was not just a ship, she was progress made visible, a promise of the new century itself. Her four towering funnels exhaled power, her decks shone with fresh paint and brass, and her name, Titanic, whispered of strength and immortality. Among the 2,200 souls boarding that day were hundreds of Americans, families, businessmen, and adventurers chasing both comfort and destiny. They came with trunks of fine clothes, framed photographs, and handwritten letters folded in coat pockets. The first-class passengers stepped proudly onto the grand staircase, their shoes echoing on the marble floor, while third-class travelers, many bound for a better life, carried children in their arms and dreams in their hearts. Everyone, in their own way, believed they were sailing into the future. As the Titanic's whistle bellowed across the harbor, the ground trembled. People on the docks.
Molly Brown dined with a group of new acquaintances, sharing stories of her travels in Europe. "I've seen kings and queens," she said, "but nothing quite so grand as this ship." Around her, the talk turned to America, to Wall Street, to politics, to the grand optimism of a country that seemed forever rising. At the Astor table, Madeline smiled as her husband told a quiet joke. The candlelight caught in her eyes, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The ship moved steadily through the night, its engines humming like a lullaby beneath their feet. In second class, the atmosphere was lively but modest. After dinner, a group gathered in the lounge to sing. A young minister played the piano, his fingers gentle on the keys. They sang, "Nearer, my God, to Thee," unaware how deeply that hymn would soon be carved into history. In third class, laughter carried through the corridors. The passengers there, so often forgotten in stories, danced to fiddles and flutes, clapping hands and stamping feet. Their joy was pure and unguarded, the joy of people who believed that tomorrow would be better. A young girl spun barefoot across the floor, her hair flying like gold in the lamplight. "We'll see New York soon," she cried. Her mother smiled and whispered, "Yes, my darling, just a few more days." Later that night, when most had retired to their cabins, a deep calm settled over the ship. The stars shone like shards of ice scattered across the sky. The ocean was so still that some said it seemed to hold its breath. Only the soft thrum of the engines broke the silence, a sound as steady as time itself. Molly Brown stood alone on deck, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She looked out across the black water, feeling the night breeze on her face. Somewhere in the dark, she thought she heard the faint cry of a seabird, a lonely, distant sound that sent a chill through her hand. "Strange," she whispered to herself. "So quiet, so very quiet." Behind her, a steward nodded politely as he passed. "Good evening, ma'am. Perfect weather tonight." "Yes," she said softly. "Almost too perfect." In the bridge above, Captain Smith watched the horizon. He felt at peace, confident, proud, and perhaps a little sentimental. After this voyage, he would retire. The Titanic would be his final command, his farewell to the sea. "A fine ship," he murmured, "a fine ship indeed." Below deck, the stokers worked tirelessly in the heat and roar of the boiler rooms, feeding the furnaces that drove the great ship forward. Sweat streamed down their faces, and the air burned with coal and fire. Yet even there, in the heart of the machine, there was a strange kind of reverence, the knowledge that they were part of something magnificent. At midnight, the ship's clocks chimed softly through the corridors. One by one, the lights dimmed. Passengers drifted into dreams. Somewhere in first class, a gramophone played the last notes of a waltz before the needle lifted with a gentle click. The Titanic sailed on, her reflection shimmering faintly on the water below. From a distance, she looked like a floating constellation, a galaxy of light moving through the endless dark. No one aboard could imagine that those same stars would soon witness the unthinkable. For now, there was only peace, the splendor, and the silence.
April 10th, 1912. The morning, Belfast wore a pale mist like a shroud, and through it the Titanic gleamed with quiet majesty. Docked at Southampton, the great liner stretched longer than any building in sight, a floating city of steel and velvet. To those who gazed upon her, she was not just a ship, she was progress made visible, a promise of the new century itself. Her 4 towering funnels exhaled power, her decks shone with fresh paint and brass, and her name, Titanic, whispered of strength and immortality. Among the 2,200 souls boarding that day were hundreds of Americans, families, businessmen, and adventurers chasing both comfort and destiny. They came with trunks of fine clothes, framed photographs, and handwritten letters folded in coat pockets. The first-class passengers stepped proudly onto the grand staircase, their shoes echoing on the marble floor, while third-class travelers, many bound for a better life, carried children in their arms and dreams in their hearts. Everyone, in their own way, believed they were sailing into the future. For the Americans on board, this voyage meant something special. The United States had become a symbol of hope and renewal, a place where fortunes could be made and old lives left behind. Families like the Astors and the Strausses embodied the grandeur of that promise. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men alive, walked the decks with quiet composure beside his young wife Madeline, who was expecting their first child. To the watching crowds, they seemed untouchable, almost royal. Not far away, Isidore and Ida Strauss, the dignified owners of Macy's department store, shared tea on deck. Their love had weathered decades, and even as the ship prepared to leave, they remained side by side, content simply to be together. On the lower decks, the American spirit took another form, humble, restless, and alive. Immigrants from Ireland, Sweden, and Italy clutched tickets stamped with the word steerage, bound for New York's Ellis Island. They had left behind farms, factories, and fading towns drawn by the distant glow of the Statue of Liberty. The cramped corridors of third class were filled with laughter, prayers, and the mingled scents of stew and sea salt. Children peeked through portholes, their eyes wide at the endless ocean waiting beyond. As the Titanic's whistle bellowed across the harbor, the ground trembled. People on the docks waved handkerchiefs, shouting goodbyes that were swallowed by the roar of the engines. The ship began to move, slow, majestic, unstoppable. For many, it was a moment of pride. For others, a quiet ache. The sight of the giant vessel fading into the horizon was like watching the world itself change shape. The orchestra on board played cheerful tunes as the shoreline slipped away. Few noticed how the sea darkened with each passing mile. Life aboard the Titanic was a world of contrasts. In first class, Americans dined on their crystal chandeliers, savoring oysters, roast duck, and fine champagne. The men discussed politics and business. The women admired the latest Paris fashions. Down below, in steerage, passengers sang folk songs late into the night, stomping their feet to keep warm. Yet in both worlds, a strange peace hung in the air, a feeling that nothing could go wrong. The ship was called unsinkable after all. Engineers, journalists, even the captain himself had said it. And so, as the Atlantic stretched out beneath the stars, most believed they were safe, invincible even. On April 14th, the fourth night at sea, the air turned colder. Ice warnings came through the telegraph room, but the messages piled up, delayed by casual chatter from other ships. The American passengers wrapped themselves in furs and stepped out to admire the moonlight glinting on the calm waves.
Some said it was the most peaceful night they had ever seen. The sea so still it felt like glass. In the smoking lounge, Colonel John Jacob Astor played cards with friends, unaware that fate had already drawn its own hand. Then came the impact, a shudder that rippled through the decks like a heartbeat gone wrong. Most barely felt it. A few curious passengers looked out their windows and saw nothing but darkness. Only the crew knew that the Titanic's side had been torn open by an iceberg lurking in the night. Water began to flood the lower compartments, slow at first, then unstoppable. Panic grew quietly, spreading like a whisper through the corridors. The orchestra kept playing to calm the guests, the gentle notes of a piano drifting up through the cold air. When the lifeboats were lowered, confusion reigned. "Women and children first," the officers cried, but there were not enough boats for everyone. Some refused to believe the ship was sinking. Others clutched each other in silent terror. On one lifeboat, Madeline Astor wept as her husband kissed her hand and stepped back, refusing to board. On another, Ida Strauss looked at her husband and shook her head gently. "Where you go, I go," she whispered, choosing to stay with him on the deck as the water rose. It was love at the edge of eternity. For the Americans who survived, the dawn of April 15th would forever haunt their lives. From the lifeboats, they watched as the Titanic's lights flickered one last time and then vanished into the Black Sea. The sound that followed was not an explosion, but a deep, human silence, broken only by the cries of those left behind. When rescue finally came, only a fraction of the passengers remained. The survivors, men, women, and children alike, were carried to New York aboard the Carpathia, their faces pale with exhaustion and disbelief. When they arrived in America, the crowds waiting at the pier did not cheer. They stood in silence, hats in hand, as the survivors stepped onto land that had once been their dream. Newspapers called it the night the world wept. The stories that emerged of courage, sacrifice, and love transformed the Titanic from a tragedy into a timeless legend. For the American families aboard, it became more than history. It was a mirror, showing both the grandeur and fragility of human ambition. And even now, more than a century later, the story of the Titanic still floats somewhere between memory and myth. Beneath the waves lies not just steel and stone, but the echo of American hearts, dreamers who believed in a brighter tomorrow. The ship that once symbolized invincibility became a reminder that even the greatest creations of man are no match for the silence of the sea. As the melancholy piano fades into the distance, one truth remains. The Titanic may have sunk, but the hope that sailed with her endures forever.
April 14th, 1912. The night arrived dressed in silver and silence. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, black as ink, smooth as glass. The stars hung low, so bright they seemed to rest upon the surface of the water. The Titanic, the great ship of dreams, glided through this frozen stillness like a cathedral of light, her decks glowing faintly under the chill of the North Atlantic sky. To those aboard, it felt like sailing through heaven itself. In the first-class promenade, wrapped in fine furs, American couples admired the night. "It's the calmest sea I have ever seen," one woman whispered, her voice lost in the hum of the engines. Somewhere near the bow, a young newlywed marriage named Madeline Astor rested her hands on the railing, feeling the cold sting of the air on her cheeks. Her husband, John Jacob Astor IV, stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the stars. "If only every night at sea were like this," he said softly. She smiled, unaware that this moment would be their last together beneath the open sky. Below deck, in third class, laughter still echoed through the corridors. Fiddles played Irish tunes, boots stomped in rhythm, and children clapped their hands. It was Sunday night, and for many immigrants aboard, Swedes, Irish, Italians, and Americans returning home, the Titanic was more than a ship. It was a chance at a new beginning. A few men leaned against the walls, speaking quietly about jobs waiting in New York. "Just 2 more days," one said with a grin, "and we'll see the Statue of Liberty." Hope filled every word. But above, on the bridge, the night carried a different kind of silence. Second Officer Lighthorler noticed how eerily still the air was. No wind, no waves, no moon. The lack of movement made spotting icebergs nearly impossible. Yet the Titanic pressed on at over 22 knots, her engine strong and steady. Inside the wireless room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked tirelessly, sending messages for passengers, dinner invitations, business notes, even jokes. When a message came from the nearby ship Mesaba, warning of heavy pack ice, it was set aside. The Marconi room was buzzing with chatter from the wealthy guests. The warning could wait. At 11:39 p.m., Lookout Frederick Fleet stood high in the crow's nest, his eyes straining into the darkness. The sea looked strangely still, no waves to break against hidden ice. He rubbed his hands together, fighting the cold. Then, through the still air, he saw it. A faint, pale shadow directly ahead, too vast to be imagined. "Iceberg, right ahead!" he shouted down through the telephone. On the bridge, First Officer Murdoch reacted instantly. "Hard a starboard," he yelled to the helmsman. "Full astern." The massive ship groaned as the engines reversed. Slowly, painfully, the Titanic began to turn, but not fast enough. At 11:40 p.m., the world shifted. A low grinding sound, not a crash, but a whisper of death, rippled along the hull. Ice tore open the steel plates below the waterline, a wound too deep to heal. On deck, most passengers felt only a gentle shudder. Some thought a propeller had broken, others that the ship had dropped anchor. In the first-class dining saloon, a few glasses rattled. A man laughed. Must be another ship passing by. No one yet understood that their fate had already been drawn its own hand. Below, the lower compartments filled swiftly. Fireman Frederick Barrett, deep in Boiler Room 6, felt the icy flood surge past his boots. "She's finished," a fellow stoker muttered. They raced for the ladders, shouting warnings that no one heard. Water rose unstoppable and cold as death itself. Within minutes, the news reached Captain Edward Smith. His face turned pale, though his voice remained calm. "Close the watertight doors," he ordered. The massive iron doors slid shut with heavy clangs, trapping the Atlantic in its icy prison. But it was too late. 5 compartments were flooding. The ship could survive 4, not 5. The crew began to rouse the passengers. "Just a precaution," they said. "Dress warmly and go on deck." Many obeyed slowly, amused rather than alarmed. Ladies slipped shawls over silk gowns. Men lit cigars as they stepped into the cold.
On the upper decks, confusion turned to unease as lifeboats were uncovered. The band played light music to keep spirits calm. "Play something cheerful," band leader Wallace Hartley told his men. So they played waltzes under the stars while history unraveled around them. In first class, disbelief reigned. "The Titanic can't sink," someone said. "It's unsinkable." But when the deck began to tilt, the truth became impossible to ignore. The order rang out, "Women and children first." Officers struggled to fill the lifeboats as fear spread. Some women refused to leave their husbands. Others clung to their children, trembling. Lifeboat number 7 left half empty, only to drift into the dark with space for dozens more. Down below, the third-class passengers were trapped behind locked gates. Panic erupted as water rushed down the corridors. Mothers banged on doors, shouting for help. Fathers lifted their children high, desperate to find a way out. By the time crewmen unlocked the barriers, the rising flood had already swallowed the lower decks. At 12:30 a.m., the bow of the Titanic was dipping sharply. On the starboard side, John Jacob Astor placed his young wife in a lifeboat. "The sea is calm, dear. You'll be fine," he said, kissing her gloved hand. "I'll see you in the morning." He turned away before she could reply. That morning would never come. Further aft, Isidore and Ida Strauss stood arm in arm. When an officer offered Ida a seat in a lifeboat, she shook her head. "We have lived together for many years," she said softly. "Where you go, I go." They sat down on the deck chairs as the sea crept closer, holding hands in the freezing wind. A love story ended quietly beneath the stars. The music played on. As the ship's lights flickered, the orchestra's final song drifted across the water. "Nearer, my God, to thee." Many passengers knelt and prayed. Others stared in silence at the impossible sight, the mighty Titanic bowing to the sea. The stars above remained still, cold and distant, shining upon a world that was ending below them. By 2 a.m., the last lifeboat had gone. Over 1,500 people remained on board, men, women, and children, clinging to hope that help might come. The ship's stern rose higher and higher, until it seemed to stand on end against the sky. Then, with a deep, echoing roar, the Titanic broke in two. A sound like thunder rolled across the sea. Those still aboard were thrown into the freezing water. The ocean, moments ago so calm, now erupted with screams, but within minutes the cries began to fade. The water was too cold, the night too windless. When the stars reflected once more on the still sea, all that remained were fragments, broken wood, floating chairs, a single violin case. At 4 a.m., the rescue ship Carpathia arrived. Lifeboats drifted silently through the mist, filled with pale, shivering survivors. Some whispered names of loved ones lost. Others stared blankly at the horizon. The sky began to lighten, but no one felt the dawn. For those who lived, that night never truly ended. They spoke of it for decades. The calm sea, the brilliant stars, the soft sound of music fading into the dark. It was as if time itself stopped, and the stars stood still to watch us die, one survivor said. More than a century later, the story of that night remains not just a tale of tragedy, but a reflection of what it means to be human, fragile, hopeful, and endlessly reaching for the light. The Titanic sailed through the calmest sea the Atlantic ever knew, and into eternity beneath the stars that refused to move. The moment of disbelief passed like a shadow. The groan of the ship echoed through the steel corridors, and the shudder beneath everyone's feet became undeniable. Passengers who had laughed minutes earlier now stared wide-eyed at the slant of the deck. The unsinkable ship was sinking, and no one knew how fast. From the bridge, Captain Edward Smith's voice rang steady but grim. "Women and children first," he ordered. His words rippled down through every deck, through polished halls and narrow stairways, through the music that still played from the ship's orchestra. But already, panic was whispering through the cold air, a kind of fear no command could quiet. On the boat deck, confusion ruled. Passengers poured out from their cabins, wrapped in nightclothes and fur coats, clutching jewelry boxes, photo albums, and crying children. The freezing wind cut through every layer of fabric. Officers shouted to organize the crowd, but few listened. "It's just a precaution," someone insisted, trying to smile. "We'll be back inside in no time." Yet, as the lifeboats creaked on their ropes and tilted over the edge, even the most skeptical began to tremble. The band, led by Wallace Hartley, played softly near the grand staircase, at first cheerful tunes, then slow, familiar hymns. The music carried through the chaos like a fragile prayer. Some paused to listen, finding comfort in the sound. Others didn't hear it at all, over the rising roar of fear. The deck lights glowed against the frozen air, casting long shadows across faces pale with disbelief. Madeline Astor stood silently among the crowd, her gloved hands pressed over her stomach, her unborn child. Her husband, John Jacob Astor, guided her gently to lifeboat number 4. "You must go now," he said quietly. "You will be safe." She shook her head, tears freezing on her cheeks. "What about you?" "I'll follow soon," he lied softly. He kissed her once and stepped back before she could reply. That morning never came. All around, similar partings unfolded, hurried, tearful, final. Isadore and Ida Strauss, the elderly owners of Macy's, refused to be separated. When told there was room for her, Ida shook her head. "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." They sat down on the deck chairs as the sea crept closer, holding hands in the freezing wind. A love story ended quietly, beneath the stars. Down in steerage, the panic was worse. Locked gates and confusion kept many from reaching the upper decks. Families pounded on the barriers, shouting for help. The corridors were knee-deep in freezing water, and every minute it rose higher. Mothers lifted children above their heads. Men rammed doors open with their shoulders. When they finally reached the main stairwell, they found the lifeboats already leaving. One Irish mother, clutching her 2 children, whispered, "We'll see the angels soon," as the water reached their waists. On the upper deck, the first lifeboats were being lowered half empty. Many refused to believe the ship was in danger. "Nonsense," said a wealthy gentleman. "I won't sit freezing in a little boat all night." Officers pleaded, but few came forward. Lifeboat number 1, built for 40, left with just 12 aboard. Below, the boilers hissed as water met flame. The ship's massive frame groaned, tilting slowly, steadily, towards the ocean's icy grip.
At 12:30 a.m., the Titanic's bow was already sinking beneath the waves. From the stern, passengers could see the horizon tilt. Some screamed, others prayed. The band kept playing, Autumn, then Nearer, My God, to Thee. Their fingers stiffened from the cold, but the music did not stop. It was the only steady thing left in a world breaking apart. Captain Smith moved among the passengers, calm and pale, helping women into lifeboats with trembling hands. When one crewman hesitated, the captain met his eyes. "Do your duty, sir." His voice was quiet, but it carried through the chaos like a final benediction. By 1 a.m., the decks were slick with frost. The last rockets fired into the sky, bright white streaks that vanished into the stars. The sound of the explosions faded into the wind. Those still aboard watched for rescue lights on the horizon, but none appeared. The nearest ship, the Californian, slept in silence less than 20 miles away, its wireless operator having gone to bed hours earlier. A young American family huddled together near the stern. A father, mother, and their small boy wrapped in a blanket. "Look at the stars," the father whispered. "They're angels watching over us." The mother smiled weakly, though tears streaked her face. When the next wave struck, the blanket slipped from her hands. The child was gone in an instant. Her scream was lost to the wind. As the Titanic's nose dipped deeper, lifeboats began to drift away, filled mostly with women and children. From their seats, survivors watched in horror as the ship's lights flickered. The great hull tilted higher, revealing its bronze propellers glinting under the stars. The screams carried across the water, thousands of voices crying for help that would never come. In one lifeboat, a man whispered, "Play for them," and the band obeyed. The faint sound of music reached the survivors, thin, trembling notes echoing across the Black Sea. Then came the sound that silenced everything, a deep, terrible roar as the ship's structure gave way. The Titanic split in two. Its stern rose upright for a heartbeat against the stars, then fell back into the abyss with a thunderous groan. The ocean swallowed it whole. Silence. Only the cries of the dying remained, drifting across the still water. Those in the lifeboats covered their ears. Some wept, others prayed. The temperature had fallen below freezing. The sea, calm as glass, became a graveyard. Every ripple, every breath of wind seemed sacred, a sound the living would remember forever. By 2:30 a.m., the last voice faded. The night that began with laughter now ended with emptiness. The survivors floated amid pieces of wreckage, chairs, suitcases, fragments of lives once bright. A baby's doll bobbed on the surface, its glass eyes staring up at the stars. In lifeboat number 6, Margaret Molly Brown wrapped her coat around a shivering woman and took the oar herself. "Keep rowing," she urged. "If we stop, we freeze." Her defiance kept them alive. Across the sea, faint lights appeared. The Carpathia, racing through the night toward the tragedy.
But for those still clinging to the wreckage, rescue came too late. When dawn broke, the sky turned pale gold over an empty ocean. The survivors looked back where the Titanic had been. There was nothing, only the gentle rise and fall of the waves, and the memory of music fading into eternity. That night, the night the band played, the lifeboats lowered, and love and courage met despair, would live forever in human memory. It was not only the story of a sinking ship, but of the hearts that refused to surrender, even as the world around them went dark. And as the icy Atlantic crept higher over the decks of the Titanic, fear could have consumed every heart. Yet amid the screams and confusion, something remarkable began to unfold. The quiet courage of ordinary souls. The great ship was dying, but the people aboard it, men, women, and children, met that fate not only with terror, but with grace. Benjamin Guggenheim, one of America's richest men, stood calmly outside his cabin as the order came to abandon ship. Moments earlier, he had helped women into lifeboats with steady hands. Now he turned to his valet and said, "We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He buttoned his waistcoat, adjusted his tie, and offered a small, almost defiant smile. As others rushed past in chaos, he and his companion took their seats in the first-class lounge, poured brandy into crystal glasses, and waited. "Tell my wife," he said to a crewman, "that I did my duty, no more, no less." It was dignity in its purest form, the kind that needs no witness. Not far away, Father Thomas Biles, an English priest bound for a new parish in New York, refused a lifeboat twice. Instead, he moved through the tilting corridors of third class, his voice rising over the roar of water. "Be calm, my children," he said, leading prayers for those who could not reach the deck. Men dropped to their knees, women clutched their children close, and the priest's words steadied their trembling hearts. In the flickering light of the sinking ship, he gave absolution to hundreds, a final act of grace amid chaos. On the upper decks, the band still played. Their music had become a fragile thread holding the night together. Wallace Hartley and his fellow musicians stood shoulder to shoulder, their fingers stiff and blue. They played not for glory, but for courage, to remind those listening that even as the sea claimed them, beauty could still exist. The hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee," drifted through the cold air like a prayer carried to heaven. Some survivors would later say that the sound was the last human thing they ever heard from the ship. For many Americans aboard, courage came not from wealth or rank, but from love. In one lifeboat, Margaret Molly Brown, the outspoken socialite, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, took charge when others froze in fear. "Row, you cowards!" she shouted at the men hesitating to pull the oars. Her determination kept the boat moving through the black water towards safety. She wrapped her shawl around a shivering child and whispered, "You'll see your mama soon, darling." Though she had boarded the Titanic as a passenger, she became a leader, fierce, relentless, unyielding. Below deck, hundreds faced death together with quiet resolve. A group of engineers stayed at their posts in the engine room, keeping the ship's lights burning until the very end. Without them, the decks would have plunged into darkness long before the last lifeboat left. They knew the cost of their service, yet they never left their stations. Their courage gave the others precious minutes to escape. When the lights finally flickered out, it was as if the ocean itself bowed to their sacrifice. Some courage came from tenderness, not strength.
Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly couple from New York, sat together near the grand staircase as the water reached their feet. They refused to part. "We have lived together for many years," Ida said softly. "Where you go, I go." Wrapped in a blanket, they held hands, whispering prayers as the world tilted around them. In their love, there was peace, a stillness no wave could wash away. Elsewhere, second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley watched as the lifeboats filled. When told it was time to lower away, he hesitated. "There are women still aboard," he said quietly, stepping back from the edge. He could have saved himself, but he could not bring himself to take another's place. That same choice echoed again and again across the deck. Fathers placing their children in lifeboats, husbands pressing a final kiss to their wives' hands, friends clasping shoulders in silent farewell. Even in the frozen dark, kindness endured. One young steward, seeing a terrified child alone, lifted her gently into a lifeboat and whispered, "Your mother's waiting there, sweetheart." He knew it wasn't true, but in that moment mercy mattered more than truth. He turned away before she could ask questions and disappeared into the crowd. As the ship sank lower, those still on board gathered where they could. Some sang hymns together, voices trembling but strong. Others prayed aloud, their words mingling with the cries of the sea. It was said later that the Titanic's final moments were not filled only with panic, but with an almost sacred calm, as if the courage of those remaining had quieted the ocean itself. When the bow finally dipped beneath the surface, the stern rose high, glistening under the stars. The few lifeboats still near enough to see it would never forget the sight. A cathedral of light and steel, filled with people who refused to surrender their humanity even in the face of death. Benjamin Guggenheim, the priest, the engineers, the band, and countless nameless souls stood as witnesses to what human dignity looks like when the world is ending. For the survivors later pulled from the sea, the memory of that night became both a wound and a wonder. They remembered not only the horror, but the heroism, the men who stepped aside so others could live, the songs played to calm the terrified, the simple, wordless bravery of strangers holding hands. One woman wrote years later, "I did not see fear that night, only love in its final form." The Titanic sank beneath the Atlantic at 2:20 a.m., taking over 1,500 lives. But in those last hours, on that freezing sea, the world saw something extraordinary. That courage is not always loud, nor heroic in appearance. Sometimes it is a man buttoning his coat, a woman refusing to abandon her husband, or a band playing for the sake of others. The courage of ordinary souls turned tragedy into legend. Though the ship lies silent beneath the waves, that spirit, unbreakable, compassionate, and profoundly human, still rises above the water, echoing through history. The Titanic's lights may have gone out, but its people illuminated the dark with something stronger than steel, the boundless courage of the human heart. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the world. Midnight had passed, yet time had lost all meaning. The Titanic, once a beacon of pride and luxury, was gone, swallowed by the freezing Atlantic. In her place floated a scattering of lifeboats, fragile wooden shells adrift on a black and merciless sea. Inside them, survivors sat in stunned silence, their breaths forming small ghosts in the cold air. The cries of the dying had faded into the distance, replaced now by the haunting rhythm of waves lapping against the boats. For hours the sea remained eerily still. The stars shimmered like shards of ice, reflected in the inky water that mirrored heaven itself. Some passengers could not bear to look back at where the great ship had gone under. Others stared endlessly into that empty horizon, as if by sheer will they could bring her back. Mothers held their children close, wrapping them in thin blankets that did little to stop the cold. Men rowed with trembling hands, the salt of sweat and tears mixing on their faces. One boat held Margaret, Molly Brown, the American socialite who had refused to sit idly while others suffered. Her voice, strong and commanding, broke the heavy silence. "Row, men, row towards the lights," she urged. Though exhausted, she rallied those around her, giving direction where despair had begun to root. In another lifeboat, a young American nurse prayed softly under her breath, her voice shaking but steady. She could still hear the faint echoes of the band's last hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee," drifting through the memory of that terrible night. The survivors did not yet know how far they were from rescue. They only knew the bitter truth. The Titanic was gone, and with her more than 1,500 souls. Some lifeboats were half empty, launched in panic or confusion. Others were crowded beyond safety, dipping dangerously close to the waterline. The officers in charge tried to keep the boats together, shouting across the dark expanse, but their voices were quickly swallowed by the vast Atlantic night. As the minutes turned to hours, the cold began to claim its own victims. A man in the bow of Boat 14 slumped forward, his body stiff from exposure. A mother tried to warm her infant by holding it against her chest, whispering lullabies through blue lips. The sea, indifferent and eternal, watched silently. There was no wind, only the creak of wood and the slow rhythmic dip of oars cutting through still water. In the distance, a faint glow appeared on the horizon, at first mistaken for dawn, then recognized as a ship flight, the Carpathia. Word spread quietly from boat to boat, carried by whispers of desperate hope. Some wept openly. Others dared not believe it, afraid their minds were playing cruel tricks in the cold. But the light grew stronger, cutting through the darkness like a promise of life. When the Carpathia finally reached them, the sea erupted with weak cheers and cries of relief. Sailors called out, throwing ropes and lifelines into the water. One by one, survivors were lifted aboard, some too weak to stand, others trembling uncontrollably as warmth finally touched their frozen skin. Blankets were wrapped around them, hot tea pressed into shaking hands. On the Carpathia's deck, a doctor moved from person to person, his face pale and hollow with fatigue. Among those rescued were men who had lost their wives, mothers who had lost their sons, and children too young to understand why their fathers were not there. The decks were filled with a quiet grief, broken only by sobs and whispered prayers. One sailor recalled later how the women clung to each other, finding strength in shared sorrow. Another remembered looking out at the sea and realizing that, beneath the gentle waves, an entire world had vanished.
As dawn broke, the full horror of the night revealed itself. The Atlantic, once dark and endless, now glimmered with sunlight, and fragments of what had been the Titanic drifted in its glow. Pieces of wood, broken deck chairs, and life belts floated aimlessly. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries piercing the heavy silence. Survivors aboard the Carpathia stood along the railings, staring into the distance, unwilling to look away from the place where their loved ones slept beneath the waves. Captain Arthur Rostrine of the Carpathia ordered his crew to search as long as possible. They found a few more lifeboats, but most were empty now, ghostly reminders of the chaos that had unfolded hours earlier. When at last the captain turned his ship toward New York, he did so with a heavy heart. On board were just over 700 survivors, each one carrying memories that would never fade. That morning, the Carpathia's wireless operator sent out a simple message: "Titanic survivors aboard, proceeding to New York." Across the Atlantic, America awoke to the news with disbelief. Families gathered around radios and newspapers, waiting for names, praying for miracles. But for those aboard the Carpathia, the reality was written in every face they saw. The vacant eyes, the trembling hands, the silence that followed every question. Night had ended, but for many, the darkness would linger forever. The Titanic was gone, yet her shadow stretched across the hearts of all who survived her. As the Carpathia steamed through calm seas, survivors sat quietly, wrapped in blankets, gazing back toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, beneath the rolling waves, lay friends, family, and the grand ship that had once been called unsinkable.
The long night of the Atlantic had ended, but its memory would never fade. The sea had taken much, but it had also revealed something unbreakable, the endurance of the human spirit. In the face of cold, fear, and loss, people had shown compassion, courage, and faith. And though the Titanic slept beneath the water, the voices of her passengers would forever echo across the waves, soft, eternal, and unforgotten. The morning of April 15, 1912 dawned quietly across America, but soon the stillness would shatter. In cities and towns from coast to coast, the first faint whispers reached telegraph wires and newsrooms. Titanic in distress, ship sinking, many lives lost. At first, few believed it. The Titanic was the largest, strongest ship in the world, unsinkable, the papers had said. But as the day unfolded, disbelief turned to horror, and horror to grief. In New York City, crowds gathered outside the offices of the White Star Line, their eyes fixed on hastily posted bulletins. The telegraph operators inside worked endlessly, receiving fragments of news from the rescue ship Carpathia. Each message brought both hope and despair. A few names were listed among the saved, but far more were marked missing. Families clung to each other in the street, waiting for news that never came. Some prayed, others wept openly. A mother fainted when she found her husband's name absent from the list. By noon, newspapers were printing special editions, the presses pounding like thunder in the city's heart. Headlines screamed across the front pages. Titanic sinks, over 1,500 lost, while beneath them ran columns of stories, tales of heroism, of sacrifice, of unimaginable sorrow. American society reeled as the truth set in. The wealthiest families in the nation had been touched by tragedy. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the world, was gone. Isidore and Ida Strauss, owners of Macy's department store, had chosen to die together rather than be parted. Their names became symbols of devotion and love in the face of death. Outside St. Patrick's Cathedral, candles burned in the cold spring wind. People stood silently, many with tears streaming down their faces. The Titanic had carried not only the elite of America, but also humble dreamers, immigrants returning home, workers seeking new beginnings, mothers and children traveling toward the promise of a better life. For every famous name lost, there were hundreds more whose stories would never be told. Across the nation, from Boston to Chicago, churches opened their doors for prayer. In small towns, bells tolled in slow, mournful rhythm. Ministers spoke of the frailty of human pride, of how man had challenged nature and paid a terrible price. In Pennsylvania, a little girl asked her teacher if the stars had fallen into the sea that night. In Kansas, a farmer who had lost a cousin aboard the ship bowed his head and said, "Even the mightiest steel can sink, but faith must float." In Washington, D.C., President William Howard Taft received word that his friend and military aide, Archibald Butt, was among the dead. The president's eyes reportedly filled with tears as he spoke softly of Butt's courage and loyalty. The nation's leaders called for an inquiry to understand how such a disaster could happen. Congress would later summon survivors and shipping officials to testify, demanding answers about the shortage of lifeboats and the failure of nearby ships to respond in time. As the days passed, the grief deepened. The Carpathia steamed slowly toward New York, carrying the survivors, just over 700 souls who had looked death in the face. The world followed her progress through daily reports. When she finally appeared in New York Harbor on the night of April 18th, thousands of people lined the docks. The scene was heavy with rain and silence. Families strained to see through the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of a familiar face. When the survivors stepped ashore, wrapped in blankets, many could not speak. They were met not by cheers, but by a hush broken only by sobs. Nearby, the morgue committee began preparing for the arrival of the dead. Coffins were built, identification lists prepared. In funeral homes and churches, black ribbons hung from doors. The luxury and pride that had once surrounded the Titanic were gone. In their place was a sense of national mourning, unlike anything America had known. Even those who had never seen the ocean felt its shadow that week. In the newspapers, editorials questioned the arrogance of calling any ship unsinkable. Writers spoke of how technology and wealth had failed against the raw power of nature. Man builds great ships, but God still rules the sea. The words resonated across a nation that suddenly felt smaller, humbler, and more fragile. Yet, amid the sorrow, stories of courage gave comfort. Accounts spread of American passengers who had shown grace and bravery, of Benjamin Guggenheim dressing in evening clothes to meet death like a gentleman, of engineer Frederick Barrett staying at his post until the final moment, and wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride sending signals until the power failed. Their actions became part of America's collective memory, reminders that even in tragedy, the human spirit can shine. In the following weeks, memorial services filled every city. At Carnegie Hall, choirs sang hymns for the lost. In Boston, the bells of Trinity Church rang 90 times, once for each known Massachusetts victim. School children wrote letters of sympathy to British families, their small hands trembling as they tried to understand the enormity of the event. Across the Atlantic, Britain mourned her own, but in America the grief felt deeply personal, like a wound shared by millions.
Months later, as summer warmed the city streets, the mourning had not yet faded. Statues were erected, plaques unveiled, and parks named in memory of those who had perished. The Titanic had become more than a shipwreck. It was a symbol, a mirror held up to humanity's dreams and limits. For Americans, it reminded them that even progress and prosperity could not shield them from fate. The ship that had promised to conquer the sea had instead revealed its vast and unforgiving power. And yet, in that morning, something else was born. A quiet unity. The tragedy crossed class and distance, binding strangers in shared grief. Rich or poor, known or unknown, they were all remembered together. In the solemn faces of those who gathered to light candles or say prayers, there was compassion stronger than despair. As night fell over New York, weeks after the sinking, the city lights reflected softly on the harbor where the Carpathia had docked. The water shimmered with peace now, but the memory of that dark April night lingered. America mourned, not just for the lives lost, but for the innocence that vanished with them. The Titanic had sailed as a triumph of human achievement. She sank as a lesson in humility. And though the years would pass, her story would remain, a requiem whispered across the Atlantic, where the stars once stood still and the dreams of a nation sank into the sea. Beneath the vast, rolling waves of the North Atlantic, the Titanic lies silent, her steel frame resting in quiet darkness miles below the surface. For over a century, she has slumbered in the cold embrace of the ocean, far from the bustling decks that once held hope, laughter, and dreams. But though the ship herself is hidden from sight, her memory sails on, not by the sea, but by the hearts of those who remember. The story of the Titanic is, at its core, a story of people. Among the more than 2,200 souls aboard were countless American families, each with their own hopes for a new beginning or a grand adventure. Mothers clasped the hands of their children, couples whispered promises under starlit skies, and fathers stood with quiet resolve. These were stories not only of tragedy, but of love, courage, and the human spirit's enduring light even in the darkest of nights. The image of Benjamin Guggenheim, dressed in his finest evening clothes, accepting his fate like a gentleman, echoes through history as a symbol of dignity and calm. The devotion of Ida and Isidor Straus, who chose to face the end together rather than be separated, speaks to the depth of love that even disaster cannot break. And countless others, some famous, many unknown, demonstrated courage in moments when fear could have easily overwhelmed them. Over the years, survivors' voices have carried these stories far beyond the tragedy itself. Their memories drift through time like soft piano notes, a melancholy melody that honors those lost and comforts those left behind. Each recollection adds a brushstroke to a vast human tapestry woven from bravery, sacrifice, and hope. Though the Titanic's journey ended abruptly in icy waters, her spirit has become timeless. Museums, memorials, books, and films keep her story alive, reminding us not only of the dangers of pride and overconfidence, but also of the power of compassion and resilience. The ship of dreams was a marvel of its age, embodying the hopes of a generation, and its legacy remains a mirror reflecting both human frailty and strength. In the quiet moments, when the world feels rushed and uncertain, it helps to remember those who sailed on the Titanic, the families dreaming of new lives, the friends who held each other close, and the souls who faced the unknown with unwavering grace. Their unfinished journey is carried forward by each telling of their story, by every memorial candle lit, and by the enduring human connection that spans generations. Though the Titanic lies beneath the waves, the spirit of those aboard sails forever, through history, memory, and the hearts of all who listen to the haunting, beautiful notes of that final voyage.